It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julian Vance laughed as he poured the vintage champagne over Clara's thrift store dress in front of the entire Gala committee. The pale gold liquid cascaded down the cheap polyester, turning the fabric a dark, clinging gray. Clara felt the sudden, biting chill against her skin, but she didn't flinch. She simply watched the bubbles fizz against her chest, listening to the sharp, collective intake of breath from the socialites surrounding them on the rooftop of Sub-Zero. "Oh, Clara," Julian said, his voice dripping with a mock concern that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "I'm so sorry. I suppose I'm just not used to seeing someone dressed for a shift at the hospital in a place like this. My hand must have slipped out of sheer confusion." Beatrice Vance stepped forward, her silk wrap fluttering like the wings of a predatory bird. She didn't offer a napkin. Instead, she adjusted the diamond necklace that had once belonged to Clara's mother, a thorn heirloom that Julian had reappropriated years ago. "Julian, darling, don't be cruel. Clara is doing her best with the little she has. It's not her fault she lacks the refinement for these circles." Tiffany Morris giggled into her gloved hand, her eyes scanning Clara with the predatory gleam of a professional influencer looking for a target. "Is that a knockoff, Clara? Or did you find it in a donation bin? Honestly, the smell of mothballs is competing with the lilies." The scent of the lilies was indeed thick in the air, cloying and sweet, mingling with the expensive cigar smoke drifting from the balcony's edge. Clara looked past her stepsister to the 3 board members of the Sterling Thorn Trust standing nearby. They were watching with varying degrees of amusement and discomfort. They saw a girl in a stained dress. They saw a charity case. They didn't see the woman who had spent the last 6 months studying the fine print of her grandmother's will. Clara's fingers brushed the small, silver locket beneath her damp collar. It was the only thing they hadn't managed to take, a piece they deemed too worthless to sell. Inside was a micro SD card containing 3 years of Julian's creative bank ledgers. "It's fine," Clara said, her voice steady and quiet. She met Julian's gaze, refusing to look down at the ruin of her clothes. The dress was cheap, but the champagne, that was a 1996 Krug, wasn't it? A bit of a waste to pour it on polyester, Julian, especially since the bank's quarterly reports are looking so thin. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening on the crystal flute. The sound of his knuckles cracking was lost beneath the ambient jazz, but Clara heard it. She saw the flash of irritation in his eyes before he masked it with his usual mask of arrogant superiority. "You should worry about your tuition, not my reports," he snapped, leaning in close enough for her to smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "You're only here because I allow it. One word from me and your little nursing dream vanishes. Do you understand your place yet?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She looked over his shoulder at the Thorn building across the skyline, its golden T glowing against the midnight blue of the city. He thought he was the king of that castle. He thought Eleanor Thorn had forgotten her only granddaughter. He thought the silence from the Thorn estate meant he had won. "I understand perfectly," she whispered. She turned and walked away, the wet fabric of her dress slapping against her legs with every step. She felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment of the elite, and Tiffany's muffled laughter following her toward the elevators. The cold wind on the balcony bit through the damp silk, but the fire in her chest was more than enough to keep her warm. As the doors slid shut, Clara pulled her phone from her pocket. She didn't call a cab. She dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "Douglas Sterling," a voice answered on the first ring. "It's Clara," she said, her voice losing its softness and turning into something sharp and metallic. "Julian just showed his hand in front of the board. He's more desperate than we thought. Is the injunction ready?" There was a pause on the other end, the sound of paper rustling. "It's ready, Clara Vance, but once we file, there's no going back. You'll be declaring war on your own family." Clara looked at her reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. She saw the wine stain, the cheap fabric, and the dark circles under her eyes from double shifts. but she also saw the thorn jawline, the steel in her expression that Julian Vance had never been able to break. "They aren't my family," she said, watching the floor numbers count down. "They're just tenants in a house that doesn't belong to them. I'll see you at 8 tomorrow morning, Douglas. Make sure the cameras are there." She hung up and stepped out into the night air. The countdown had begun. In 48 hours, Julian Vance wouldn't be pouring champagne. He'd be lucky if he could afford water. She reached into her purse and touched the heavy, embossed invitation to the Thorn Anniversary Gala. Julian thought he was the host. He had no idea. He was actually the entertainment. The next morning, the Vance estate was filled with the sharp, metallic scent of silver polish and the frantic energy of a looming social climb. Clara Vance stood in the foyer, her hand tightening on the strap of her weathered nursing bag as she watched a team of movers carry her mother's antique mahogany vanity toward a waiting truck. Beatrice Vance stood in the center of the chaos, draped in a silk robe that cost more than Clara's annual tuition. She was ticking items off a digital tablet with the clinical detachment of an executioner. She didn't look up when the front door closed. "Don't just stand there, Clara," Beatrice said, her voice like fine grit sandpaper. "The estate auction starts at noon. If you want any of this clutter, you'd better start bidding, though I doubt a student's stipend covers thorn-quality heirlooms." Clara felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, but she channeled it into the cold, hard space where her plan was taking shape. She walked toward the vanity, her fingers brushing the wood. "This was my mother's, Beatrice. It's been in the Thorn family for 3 generations. And now it's being liquidated to pay for Tiffany's debutante tour in Paris," Beatrice replied, finally meeting her gaze with a smirk. "Space is a luxury, dear, and frankly, your mother's taste was as outdated as her health." A high-pitched chime cut through the room as Tiffany Morris bounded down the stairs, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble. She was draped in a designer tracksuit, holding a delicate gold pendant, a thorn emerald up to the light. "Mom, look," Tiffany chirped, ignoring Clara entirely. "It's so vintage chic. It'll look amazing in my Get Ready With Me video for the gala." "Put that back, Tiffany," Clara said, her voice low and steady. "That wasn't part of the auction list." Tiffany laughed, a bright, empty sound that grated on Clara's nerves. "Everything is on the list when you're the one holding the pen, Clara. Besides, it's not like you have anywhere to wear it, unless they started inviting the help to the Thorn Anniversary Gala." Clara reached into her pocket, her thumb grazing the screen of her phone. She hit the record button. "My father knows you're selling these pieces." "These aren't Vance assets. They belong to the Thorn Trust." "The trust I manage," a booming voice interrupted. Julian Vance stepped out of his study, adjusting his gold cufflinks. He didn't look at his daughter. He looked at the furniture being hauled away as if he were counting stacks of cash. "And as your father, I've decided that holding on to these relics is a sentimental weakness we can no longer afford. We have an image to maintain, Clara, one that doesn't involve dusty drawers and your constant brooding." He finally turned to her, his eyes cold. "I heard you were bothering Douglas Sterling yesterday. Stay away from him. He's the Thorn family attorney, not your personal counselor. If I find out you're trying to contest the estate again, I'll stop the tuition payments entirely. Do I make myself clear?" Clara felt the weight of the phone in her pocket, capturing every word of his admission. "Perfectly," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Good," Julian snapped. "Now get out. We have the board members coming over for a pre-gala brunch, and you look like you haven't slept in a week. You're an eyesore." Clara turned on her heel and walked out, the sound of her father's dismissive laughter following her into the driveway. She climbed into her beat-up sedan, the engine groaning as it turned over. As she pulled away, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Douglas Sterling. "The filing is complete. The court has frozen the Thorn primary accounts effective immediately. They just don't know it yet." Clara looked at the house in the rearview mirror. Julian thought he was clearing out the clutter, but he was actually stripping the stage for his own downfall. She reached into her bag and pulled out the heavy, embossed invitation she had taken the night before. The Thorn Anniversary Gala was exactly 24 hours away. Julian Vance had spent years making her feel like a guest in her own life, a charity case in her own home. But as the sun caught the gold leaf on the invitation, Clara realized she wasn't just going to the party. She was the one who was going to turn out the lights. The countdown had reached its final day. By tomorrow night, the emerald Tiffany was flaunting wouldn't be a fashion statement, it would be evidence. And Julian wouldn't be managing a trust, he'd be lucky if he was managing a prison canteen. Clara shifted the car into gear, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. The auction of memories was over. Now, the real bidding began. 2 days remained until the Thorn Anniversary Gala, and the air in the city felt heavy with the scent of impending rain. Clara sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Douglas Sterling, the only man who still remembered her mother's real name. The room smelled of aged paper and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic hallways of the hospital where she had spent her morning shift. Douglas leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light from the desk lamp. He slid a thick manila envelope across the polished surface toward her. "Julian thinks the statute of limitations has passed on the Thorn Trust," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He believes that because he managed to have you declared a ward of the state after your mother died, the trail is cold. He's wrong. These documents prove he forged the signatures to liquidating your mother's private holdings 3 months before the probate court even opened." Clara ran her fingers over the embossed seal on the envelope. The paper felt heavy, a physical weight that matched the pressure in her chest. For years, Julian Vance had treated her like a parasite in his home, a charity case who should be grateful for the scraps he tossed from his table. He didn't know that Douglas had been quietly archiving every discrepancy, every stolen cent, and every forged document for over a decade. "It's all here," she asked. "Everything," Douglas confirmed. "But there is one piece missing, the correspondence. If we want a leaner Thorn to see the truth, we need the letters Julian intercepted. Without them, he can claim he was just a bad businessman. With them, he's a kidnapper of a legacy." Clara nodded. She knew exactly where they were. An hour later, she stepped into the foyer of the Vance estate. The house was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. 2 caterers hurried past her carrying crates of vintage champagne, the clinking of glass echoing against the marble floors. The scent of lilies, Beatrice's favorite, was so thick it was almost suffocating. "Watch where you're going," a sharp voice snapped. Tiffany stood at the base of the grand staircase, draped in a silk robe that cost more than Clara's tuition for the year. She was holding a pair of emerald earrings against her ears, admiring her reflection in the gilded mirror. She didn't even look at Clara. She simply looked at Clara's reflection with a sneer of pure disgust. "The help uses the service entrance, Clara. Or have you forgotten your place again?" Tiffany laughed, a shrill, entitled sound that made the hair on the back of Clara's neck stand up. "Actually, don't bother coming in at all tomorrow. Julian said your presence would lower the aesthetic of the gala. We've told the guests you're away on a scholarship in another state. It sounds much better than admitting you're scrubbing bedpans at a county hospital." Clara didn't flinch. She simply watched her stepsister preen. "I'll be out of your way soon enough, Tiffany." "See that you are," Julian said, stepping out of his study. He was adjusting the cufflinks on his bespoke shirt, his expression one of bored superiority. He looked at Clara as if she were a stain on the rug he was considering having cleaned. "I've already had the locks changed on the guest suite. Your things are in the garage. I suggest you move them before the valet service arrives tomorrow. I won't have your clutter ruining the first impression for Douglas Sterling and the Thorn party." The irony was a cold, sharp blade in Clara's mind. Julian was so busy polishing his image for the very people he had robbed that he couldn't see the fire she was about to light. "I just need to check the basement for a few of my mother's old books," Clara said, her voice intentionally small. Julian waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, just stay out of the way of the decorators. And Beatrice sold that old piano today, so don't go looking for it. We needed the floor space for the ice sculpture." The rage spiked in Clara's throat, hot and bitter. Her mother's piano, the last thing she had played before the cancer took her, sold like a piece of junk to make room for a block of melting ice. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, but she forced a submissive nod. She descended the narrow stairs to the basement, leaving the sounds of luxury behind. The air here was different, damp, smelling of oil and old stone. She navigated past stacks of Tiffany's discarded influencer props and Julian's old golf clubs until she reached the heavy, thrumming bulk of the industrial boiler. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt on the cold concrete. Behind the copper pipes, tucked into a recess in the foundation that Julian didn't even know existed, sat a rusted metal lockbox. She pulled it out, the metal scraping against the floor. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Clara, all from a leaner Thorne. "My dearest granddaughter, why do you not answer? Your father tells me you are still too ill to speak, but surely a note. Clara, Julian says you have decided to move to Europe to forget the pain of your mother's passing. I am heartbroken that you would leave without saying goodbye." The lies were laid bare in elegant, shaking handwriting. Julian hadn't just stolen her money. He had systematically isolated a grieving child from the only family she had left, telling the grandmother she was dead or indifferent while telling the child she was abandoned. Clara clutched the box to her chest. The heat from the boiler was intense, but she felt like ice. She had the bank records. She had the forged signatures. And now, she had the proof of the emotional execution Julian Vance had attempted to perform on her. She climbed the stairs, the box hidden inside her oversized tote bag. As she passed the study, she heard Julian laughing with Beatrice, boasting about the new era the Thorne partnership would bring to their family. Clara stepped out into the night air, the first drops of rain finally beginning to fall. She looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion. Julian thought he was preparing for his greatest victory. He was actually just decorating the room where she was going to ruin him. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Douglas Sterling. "I have the letters. 48 hours to go." The following afternoon, the Vance estate smelled of expensive desperation and industrial-strength floor wax. Clara Vance stood on the mezzanine, watching the frantic choreography of the gala preparations below. The grand ballroom, usually a cold and cavernous space, was being transformed into a temple of corporate vanity. The scent of lilies was overwhelming. Thousands of white blooms had been trucked in, their waxy petals exhaling a fragrance so thick it felt like a physical weight against her chest. Julian Vance stood in the center of the chaos, his voice booming over the rhythmic screech of chairs being dragged across the marble floor. He was orchestrating the Thorne partnership event as if it were his own coronation. Every few minutes, he would bark a command at a worker, his face flushed with the intoxicated arrogance of a man who believed he had already won. "Don't just stand there like a decorative fixture," Julian snapped, his eyes finding Clara. He didn't wait for her to respond, simply pointing a finger toward the service entrance where crates of crystal were being unloaded. "The caterers are short-handed. If you're going to continue occupying a room in this house, you can at least make yourself useful for the Thorne family's arrival." Clara descended the stairs slowly, her heels clicking a steady, deliberate beat against the stone. She felt a strange, detached calm. In her pocket, the edges of a flash drive pressed against her thigh, a secret weight that made his insults feel like distant static. "The Thorne family has very particular standards, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the hammers. "Are you sure you've accounted for every detail?" He let out a sharp, condescending bark of a laugh. "I've spent months securing this deal. I know exactly what Douglas Sterling and a leaner Thorne expect. They expect excellence, something you wouldn't understand between your hospital shifts and those stained textbooks." He stepped closer, his expensive, woodsy cologne clashing with the floral air. "Tomorrow night, I'll be the man who saved the Vance legacy. You'll be the girl in the corner, lucky to even be in the room." "I think tomorrow night will be a revelation for everyone," Clara replied, her gaze never wavering. "You should be careful with the fine print, Julian. Sometimes the most important truths are hidden in the parts you choose to ignore." Julian smirked, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of a nearby gold leaf mirror. He didn't even look at her as he spoke. "Your advice is as worthless as your bank account. Go help with the linens. Try not to get your fingerprints on the silver." He turned his back on her, dismissing her with the casual cruelty he had perfected over years of emotional execution. He didn't notice Beatrice Vance standing by the floral arrangements. Her mother's eyes narrowed as she watched Clara. For the first time, Beatrice didn't see a submissive daughter. She saw a woman who looked like she was holding a winning hand in a game Julian didn't even know they were playing. The tension only escalated as the sun began to set. Tiffany Morris swept through the ballroom like a whirlwind of silk and entitlement, her phone held aloft as she live-streamed the preparations to her followers. "And here's the help," Tiffany chirped, turning the camera toward Clara, who was silently organizing the seating cards. "My darling stepsister is finally practicing for her future career as a servant. Isn't she precious?" She laughed, a shrill, grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Make sure you don't trip tomorrow, Clara. It would be such a shame if you ruined my big moment in front of the Thorn heir." Clara didn't flinch. She simply placed the last card on the table, the one reserved for the head of the Thorn estate. "Don't worry, Tiffany. I have a feeling the cameras will be focused exactly where they need to be." By midnight, the house had fallen into a predatory silence. Clara sat in her small room, the moonlight spilling across the floor in silver bars. Her phone buzzed. A message from Douglas Sterling. "The inheritance documents are verified. The board is briefed. Everything is ready for the reveal." Clara looked at the Thorn family ring she'd kept hidden for years, the sapphire glowing in the dark like a cold, blue eye. Julian thought he was building a stage for his triumph. He was actually just decorating the room where she was going to ruin him. 24 hours to go. She closed her eyes, listening to the house creak. Downstairs, Julian was likely toasting to his future with a glass of vintage scotch. He had no idea that the foundation of his world was already dust. Tomorrow, the sleeping lion wouldn't just wake up. She would hunt. The evening of the Thorn founders' dinner arrived with a chilling, elegant precision. The grand ballroom of the Thorn estate was a cathedral of excess, lit by 3 massive crystal chandeliers that cast a fractured, diamond-like glow over the gathered elite. The air was thick with the scent of expensive gardenias and the heavy, oaky aroma of aged brandy. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music nearly drowned out by the rhythmic clinking of silver against fine bone china and the low, self-important hum of the city's most powerful families. Julian Vance stood at the center of the room, his chest puffed out beneath a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than most people's annual rent. He held a glass of vintage champagne, swirling the pale gold liquid with the practiced ease of a man who believed the world was his personal plaything. Beside him, Beatrice Vance preened in a gown of shimmering gold sequins, her neck adorned with a heavy sapphire pendant that caught the light with every shallow breath she took. Clara recognized that necklace. It had belonged to her mother, a Thorn heirloom that Beatrice had claimed as her own the moment she'd moved into the house. Seeing it now, draped over the woman who had treated her like a servant for a decade, sent a jolt of cold fire through Clara's veins. She adjusted the strap of her clutch, feeling the hard, reassuring edge of the sapphire ring tucked inside. "Look at her," Tiffany Morris whispered, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearby guests. She stood next to Julian, her phone held aloft as she scanned the room for the perfect lighting. She sneered as she looked Clara up and down. "She actually showed up in that. I told you, Dad, charity cases never know how to dress for the occasion. It's practically a rag." Julian didn't even turn his head to look at his daughter. He was busy laughing at a joke made by a city councilman, but he spared a dismissive wave of his hand toward Clara. "She's here to witness the legacy, Tiffany. Even a stray needs to see what a real family looks like before it's sent back to the gutter." Clara didn't flinch. She stood near a marble pillar, her navy silk dress, simple, elegant, and perfectly tailored, making her look like a shadow in a room full of peacocks. She watched as Julian moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting early congratulations for a promotion everyone assumed was coming tonight. He was at his peak, his arrogance radiating off him like heat. "Enjoying the view, Clara?" Beatrice asked, gliding over with a predatory smile. She reached out, her sharp, manicured nails grazing the fabric of Clara's sleeve. "I suppose this is the closest you'll ever get to a life like this. Make sure you don't spill anything. I'd hate to have to deduct the cleaning fee from your final allowance before we part ways." "The view is very illuminating, Beatrice," Clara replied, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. She met the older woman's gaze without blinking. "It's amazing how much you can see when people think you're invisible." Beatrice scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "Don't get smart with me. You're only here because Julian wanted a front row seat to your realization that you are nothing. Once the Thorn Foundation papers are signed tonight, you're out. No more school, no more roof over your head. You'll be exactly what your mother was, a footnote." Clara felt the weight of the secret she carried, a hidden power that made Beatrice's insults feel like the buzzing of a fly. Across the room, she saw Douglas Sterling. The attorney was standing near the heavy oak doors, his expression unreadable as he spoke with a group of stern-faced men in charcoal suits. He caught Clara's eye and gave a single, imperceptible nod. The board was here. The tension in the room shifted as the double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. A hush fell over the crowd. Eleanor Thorne entered, leaning slightly on a silver-topped cane. Even at 80, the matriarch of the Thorne family commanded the room with a terrifying gravity. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the guests before settling on the head table. Julian's face lit up with a hunger that was almost visceral. He straightened his tie and began to move toward her, his hand already extended. "Mother Eleanor," he called out, his voice dripping with a false, oily reverence. "The evening is perfect. We are all ready for your announcement." Eleanor didn't take his hand. She looked at him with a cold, clinical detachment that made the councilman beside him shift uncomfortably. "I'm sure you are, Julian. You've always been very ready." She moved past him, her gaze lingering on Clara for a fraction of a second longer than anyone else. A ripple of confusion went through the witnesses. Why was the great Eleanor Thorne looking at the quiet girl in the corner? "Ignore her," Julian hissed to Beatrice as they took their seats at the head table. "The old woman is sentimental. She probably sees a resemblance to the help. It doesn't matter. The documents are on the podium. Sterling confirmed everything is verified." The dinner proceeded with agonizing slowness. Course after course of delicate, overpriced food was served, but Clara barely touched hers. She watched the clock. She watched Julian drink. She watched the way he leaned over to Douglas, whispering something that made the attorney's jaw tighten. Finally, the coffee was served. The string quartet stopped playing. Julian stood up, tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sound was sharp, cutting through the low chatter like a knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with a confidence that bordered on mania. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the most influential guests. "Tonight is not just about celebrating the Thorne legacy. It is about the future. For years, I have steered this ship, protecting the interests of this family and this foundation. And tonight, as we honor the founder, we also look toward the permanent leadership that will carry us into the next century." He looked down at Clara, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his lips. He didn't hide it anymore. He wanted her to feel the crushing weight of her supposed defeat. "I invite Douglas Sterling and Eleanor Thorne to the podium," Julian said, stepping aside with a grand gesture, "to finalize the succession that we have all been waiting for." Douglas stepped forward, carrying a thick leather folder. He didn't look at Julian. He looked directly at the back of the room, where the security team had quietly moved to block the exits. Clara stood up. She didn't wait for an invitation. The sound of her chair scraping against the marble floor was loud in the sudden silence. Julian's brow furrowed. "Clara, sit down. This isn't your moment." "Actually, Julian," Clara said, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "I think you'll find that it is." She began to walk toward the podium, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. Every head in the room turned. Beatrice's glass paused midair. Tiffany's phone dropped an inch as she forgot to record. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Security, remove this girl immediately. She's clearly had a breakdown." But the security guards didn't move toward Clara. They stayed at the doors, their eyes fixed on Julian. Douglas Sterling opened the folder and cleared his throat. He looked at the board members, then at the stunned audience. "Before we proceed with the signature of the succession papers," Douglas said, his voice echoing with legal authority, "there is the matter of the primary beneficiary's identity to confirm, and the small issue of 5 years of systemic embezzlement from the Thorne Trust." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's smirk didn't just fade. It vanished, replaced by a look of sudden, flickering uncertainty. He looked at the podium, then at Clara, who was now standing 5 feet away from him, her eyes as cold as the sapphire on Beatrice's neck. "What are you talking about?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking. "I am the successor. I have the papers." "You have the papers I allowed you to see, Julian," Eleanor Thorne said, her voice cutting through his protest like a guillotine. Clara reached into her clutch and pulled out the Thorne signet ring. She slipped it onto her finger and stepped into the light of the podium. The sapphire caught the overhead glow, blazing with a deep, royal blue. "The lion is awake, Julian," Clara whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. "And she's very, very hungry." The ballroom, which had been a symphony of clinking crystal and polite laughter only minutes ago, was now a tomb. The heavy, cloying scent of white lilies, once elegant, now felt like the suffocating perfume of a funeral. Clara stood at the podium, the Thorne signet ring catching the overhead light with a brilliance that seemed to blind those in the front row. The deep sapphire glowed like a piece of the midnight sky, a silent, heavy weight that finally anchored her to the earth. Julian Vance took a stumbling step forward, his hands shaking so violently that the champagne glass he still held rattled against his wedding band. "That's a fake," he hissed, though the conviction had vanished from his voice, replaced by a thin, reedy desperation. "She's a liar! Security, get this girl out of here immediately. She's trespassing." But no one moved. The guards, men Julian had hired with money that was never truly his, looked toward Eleanor Thorne. The matriarch didn't even glance at them. She kept her gaze fixed on the man who had tried to erase her granddaughter from existence, her posture as rigid and unforgiving as granite. "The only fake in this room, Julian, is the life you've built on the bones of my daughter's legacy," Eleanor said. Her voice was a low, dangerous thrum that carried to the furthest corners of the hall. Douglas Sterling stepped into the light then, his leather briefcase making a sharp, final click as he opened it. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the crowd, the witnesses to this long-overdue execution. With a practiced, clinical motion, he handed a tablet to the technician at the back of the room. The massive screens behind the podium, which had been displaying soft-focus images of the Foundation's charity work, flickered and changed. They didn't show orphans or hospitals now. They showed bank ledgers. Thousands of transactions, highlighted in a damning, digital crimson, traced a direct line from the Thorne Trust to private offshore accounts controlled by a shell company. Julian's signature, unmistakable and arrogant, was stamped across every digital page. Julian's face didn't just pale. It underwent a violent, structural disintegration. The arrogant mask he'd worn for decades shattered, leaving behind a frantic, twitching mess. His eyes, once sharp with predatory greed, became glassy and unfocused, darting around the room as if looking for a trapdoor in the marble floor. His jaw went slack, his lower lip trembling with a pathetic, wet vibration that made him look decades older in a single heartbeat. The flush of expensive scotch and triumph drained away, replaced by a sickly, gray pallor that clung to his skin like damp ash. Every muscle in his neck corded as he struggled to swallow a truth that was clearly choking him. He looked like a man watching his own ghost walk away, realized too late that he was the one being haunted. "No," he croaked, the word barely audible. "There must be a mistake. Beatrice, tell them she's delusional." Beatrice Vance was already backing away. Her face was a mask of social horror, her hand clutching the pearls at her throat so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She didn't look like a mother or a wife. She looked like a rat realizing the ship was already deep underwater. Beside her, Tiffany Morris was frozen, her phone, usually an extension of her arm, dangling forgotten at her side. The influencer's carefully curated world of status and mockery had evaporated into the cold gala air. "You spent 5 years treating me like a ghost in my own home," Clara said, her voice steady and cold. She leaned into the microphone, her eyes never leaving his. "You told me I was nothing. You told me I didn't belong in this world. But the truth is, Julian, you were only ever a guest in mine." A ripple of whispers broke the silence, a collective shifting of loyalty that was almost audible. The Thorn board members were already huddled, their faces grim and professional. Douglas Sterling handed Julian a single, heavy sheet of paper. "What is this?" Julian asked, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Your formal notice of eviction from all Thorn-owned properties, effective immediately," Douglas replied, "and a copy of the criminal referral currently being filed with the district attorney's office. You have 10 minutes to leave this building before the police arrive to escort you." Julian looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face. He found none. The people who had been laughing at his jokes and drinking his wine only minutes ago were now looking at him with the clinical disgust one might reserve for a stain on an expensive rug. Clara stepped down from the podium. She felt the cold, heavy weight of the sapphire ring on her finger, not as a burden, but as a shield. She walked past Julian, her shoulder brushing his, but she didn't stop. She didn't need to see the end. "Enjoy the walk home, Julian," she whispered as she passed, the sound of her heels on the marble floor the only thing breaking the absolute silence of his ruin. "I hear the city is very cold this time of year." She walked out of the ballroom without looking back, leaving Julian standing alone in the center of a circle that was rapidly growing wider. The silence that followed Clara's exit wasn't empty. It was a physical weight that seemed to press the oxygen right out of the room. Julian Vance stood frozen at the center of the ballroom, his hands hovering over the mahogany podium as if it were the only thing keeping him from sinking through the floor. The scent of spilled, vintage champagne, the bottle he'd opened to celebrate a victory that had turned into a public execution, hung heavy and cloying in the air, mixing with the sharp, metallic ozone of the projector that was still humming behind him. Julian Vance's face didn't just pale. It seemed to decompose in real time under the harsh, unforgiving glow of the crystal chandeliers. The calculated, smug mask of a high-powered bank executive shattered, leaving behind a frantic, graying mess of a man. His left eye developed a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that pulled at his temple, while his lower lip trembled so violently he had to bite it to stop the visible vibration. A sheen of cold, oily sweat broke out across his forehead, matting his carefully styled hair and causing his expensive silk tie to suddenly look like a noose. His jaw hung slack, revealing the desperate, shallow gasps of a man who had forgotten how to breathe in a world where he was no longer the master. "This is a mistake," Julian croaked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He looked toward the front row, searching for the board members who had been laughing at his jokes only an hour ago. "Douglas, tell them these documents are forged. Clara she's unstable. She's a nursing student with a grudge." Douglas Sterling stepped forward, his polished Oxfords clicking with lethal precision on the marble floor. He didn't look like a friend anymore. He looked like a surgeon preparing to remove a tumor. He held a leather-bound folder in his hand, the gold Thorn family seal catching the light. "The only thing unstable here, Julian, is your future. These documents have been verified by the state Supreme Court. The Thorn inheritance was never yours to manage, let alone to drain. You were a steward who mistook himself for a king." Beatrice Vance let out a sharp, strangled sob. She was clutching her throat, her fingers digging into the pearls that Clara had identified as stolen heirlooms. Her social climbing poise had evaporated, replaced by the raw, jagged terror of a woman who realized she was about to be evicted from the only life she valued. Beside her, Tiffany Morris had dropped her phone. The screen was shattered, the bright light of her social media feed flickering and dying on the floor, a perfect metaphor for the influence she had built on a foundation of stolen wealth. Tiffany looked at the crowd, her eyes wide as she realized that the people she had spent years looking down upon were now looking at her with a clinical, detached disgust. "You can't do this," Julian suddenly screamed, his desperation finally boiling over into a useless, impotent rage. He lunged toward Douglas, but two uniformed security guards moved with practiced efficiency, blocking his path. "I built this. I kept the Thorne name alive. I deserve that money for everything I put up with." "You didn't build anything," a new voice cut through the chaos. Eleanor Thorne walked into the room, her silver-headed cane striking the marble like a gavel. She moved with the effortless authority of a woman who had spent decades at the top of the food chain. She stopped 3 feet from Julian, her gaze raking over him as if he were a particularly unpleasant stain on a rug. "You suppressed my granddaughter. You lied to me, telling me she was dead so you could feast on her mother's legacy. You are not a Thorne, Julian. You are barely a Vance. You are a thief who stayed in the house too long." Julian collapsed back against the podium, his legs finally giving out. He looked at the faces of the witnesses, the socialites, the business rivals, the neighbors he had spent years trying to impress. They were moving away from him, a literal circle of space opening up as people physically distanced themselves from his ruin. The social death was instantaneous. "The accounts are already frozen, Julian," Douglas added, his voice dropping to a cold, professional whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. "We took the liberty of securing the Vance family assets an hour before this meeting began. The house, the cars, the offshore accounts you thought were hidden, they've all been placed under a legal lien. You don't even own the suit you're wearing." Julian looked up, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He saw Beatrice looking at him not with sympathy, but with a burgeoning, venomous hatred. She realized he had dragged her down with him. He saw Tiffany weeping, not for her father, but for her lost status. Clara appeared in the doorway of the ballroom one last time. She was wrapped in a simple, dark coat, looking every bit the modest student they had mocked, yet she carried a quiet power that made the entire room turn toward her. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at the man who had stolen her childhood and her mother's memory. "I told you the truth would be expensive, Julian," Clara said, her voice steady and echoing in the hollow space. "I hope you saved enough of your pride to afford the walk home, because from this moment on, you are a stranger to this name." She turned and walked away, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her with a final, booming thud. Julian was left in the center of the ballroom, the silence returning, broken only by the distant, approaching wail of sirens that were coming just for him. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled, though the air in the Thorne estate felt cleaner, as if a long-lingering fever had finally broken. Clara Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the study, watching the rain wash over the manicured gardens. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine drifted through the cracked glass, a sharp contrast to the stale, suffocating perfume that used to haunt these halls. She wore a simple, charcoal-gray sweater and jeans, clothes that didn't demand attention, yet she moved with a quiet authority that the house seemed to recognize. A soft tap at the door drew her attention. Douglas Sterling entered, his leather briefcase looking worn and professional. He didn't offer a celebratory smile. He knew better. Instead, he placed a single, thin folder on the mahogany desk. "It's finished, Clara," he said, his voice steady. "The final liquidation of the Vance holdings was completed this morning. After the legal fees and the restitution to the Thorne Trust, there was very little left." Clara didn't turn around immediately. She thought of the man who had once stood at the head of every table, demanding a respect he hadn't earned. And Julian. "He's moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in the industrial district," Douglas replied, adjusting his glasses. "The bank stripped his pension, and the board made sure his name was blacklisted across the tri-state area. He's currently working as a night shift clerk for a logistics firm. It's a far cry from the corner office." Clara finally turned, her gaze landing on the folder. She didn't feel the surge of triumph she had expected. Instead, there was only a profound sense of equilibrium. Julian Vance had spent decades building a throne out of stolen wood. It was only right that he ended up on the floor. "And the others?" she asked. Beatrice Vance filed for divorce 3 weeks after the scandal broke, the lawyer said, a hint of dry irony in his tone. She tried to sue for a portion of the Thorne inheritance, claiming emotional distress. The judge dismissed it in under 10 minutes. Last I heard, she was selling her remaining jewelry to keep up with the lease on a studio apartment. She's learned quite quickly that her friends have very short memories. Clara nodded slowly. She could almost see Beatrice frantically calling socialites who would no longer pick up the phone. It was a social death, a slow fading into the obscurity she had feared most. And Tiffany Morris. She's working, Douglas said. An entry-level retail job at a department store, not the high-end boutiques she used to frequent, a standard outlet in the suburbs. Her social media accounts were deleted after the harassment became too much to handle. The influencer lifestyle doesn't work when your only influence is a cautionary tale about greed. Clara walked to the desk and picked up a fountain pen. The cold, heavy weight of the metal felt grounding. She signed the final papers, her signature fluid and certain. With a single stroke, she officially dissolved the last ties to the people who had tried to erase her. "Thank you, Douglas," she said. "Your grandmother is waiting for you in the garden," he reminded her softly. "She wants to discuss the scholarship foundation." As the lawyer exited, Clara stayed in the room for a moment longer. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. It was the only thing she had managed to claw back from the pawnshop Beatrice had frequented. Inside was a faded photo of her mother, smiling in a sun-drenched field. The cost of this victory sat heavy in her chest. She had won back her name, her fortune, and her house, but she could never win back the years of silence. She couldn't undo the way she had learned to flinch at the sound of a raised voice, or the way she still caught herself counting her pennies out of habit. Justice was a clean burn, but it left scars nonetheless. She stepped out onto the terrace, the cool mist hitting her face. Eleanor Thorne was sitting in a wrought iron chair, a tea service laid out before her. The older woman looked up, her sharp eyes softening as Clara approached. "Is it done?" Eleanor asked. "It's done," Clara said, taking the seat opposite her. "Good." Eleanor reached across the table, her hand covering Clara's. "Then let's stop looking back. The gardens need replanting and the house is far too quiet. It's time we filled it with something other than ghosts." Clara looked out at the estate, the Thorne legacy, finally back in the hands of a Thorne. She thought of Julian, sitting in a cramped, gray room, realizing that the daughter he had treated as a servant was now the architect of his ruin. He was on the outside looking in, shivering in the cold reality he had created for himself. Clara took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was exactly where she belonged.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.